Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to Bridging the Gap, a series where we tackle difficult and controversial topics Muslims deal with across generational divides. We provide a safe space for Muslims of all ages to openly discuss these issues and share their stories to foster community, overcome widespread challenges, and provide insight and education to non-Muslims about Islam. My name is Kassidy Demaio, and I'm the Operations Manager at the Lighthouse Project in Cary, North Carolina. I'll be one of your hosts alongside my coworker, Mohsen Zakaib.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Mohsen Zakaib, and I am the Programs Manager here at the Lighthouse Project. We have a very, very exciting episode, inshallah, tonight. We are joined here by some amazing people in our community that are going to be discussing this crucial topic. We're joined here by Ismaaeel Ali, who is the President of the Muslim Student Association at the Wake Tech Community College. We're joined by Safa Ahmed, who is an activist as well as the media associate at Indian American Muslim Council, as well as Brittani Clark and her husband Arssante Malone, who Brittani is the community advocate, mother, PhD candidate, educator, board member for a community-based organizations. Wow, I mean, can we get an applause for just that?
MashaAllah.
MashaAllah. And then we're also joined by Arssante Malone, who's the community activist, educator, martial artist, and a parent. I absolutely love that in your bios that we requested from you guys. You guys put parent and mother because I think that's very important. And then of course we're joined by Relwan Onikoyi, who is a graduate student. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion from Temple University, and he is currently also the lecturer at NC State University in the Religious Studies Department. He is also a husband and a father. I'm pretty sure he just added that, but mashallah. Thank you guys so much for joining. We are super excited again for this topic, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to Kassidy to talk about what we're going to be discussing today.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Mohsen. Those are some great introductions, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today and to get your insight and your wisdom onto some of these, tough topics. Speaking of, today we are going to be talking about racism in Islam and within the Muslim community. I want to thank you all here again for speaking on this. I do want to note that our conversation today is going to be based off of personal experiences and our personal insight. So what is said here in this podcast is not reflective of the opinions of all the different community members. So yeah, and with that, let's get going.
Alrighty, let's jump into it. Well, I think this is a fitting first question. Do you think racism exists in the Muslim community? Because if the answer is no, then I think we kind of concluded our podcast. But yeah, do you think racism exists in the Muslim community?
Well, I guess I'll speak first. I definitely think that there are some elements of prejudice and discrimination within the Muslim community that I feel like personally stem from cultural variables such as wanting to maintain their own culture or not wanting to be integrated into another culture. So I definitely think some racism elements exist in the community for sure.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, and I want to add that it's important for us to be, to recognize, of course, it exists. It's almost impossible for it not to exist because Muslims are human. I think part of the issues is that we think Islam will resolve everything. So we think that we'll be free from these societal issues that plague other communities. So once we recognize, Islam is only carried by Muslims, and Muslims are human beings, then they're going to be susceptible to any other societal disease. And most certainly, we've fallen prey to racism as well.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that you made there that Muslims are humans too, and just like anybody else, we can fall victim to some societal diseases, as you call them, such as racism. And I know I've experienced it. I'm sure some other people in this, discussion have experienced it as well. And it's definitely a serious issue that, needs to be addressed and needs to be solved because Islam, of course, it condemns racism, but Muslims can still be racist for sure.
Go ahead, sir.
I think it's so important that both of you pointed out that Muslims are inherently imperfect, even though Islam is perfect, because I think there's a lot of defensiveness in the Muslim community. And I speak as someone who is Desi, my family's from India. So there's a lot of defensiveness within the Muslim community, especially as I've noticed amongst Arabs and Desis, who kind of tend to project Islam and Muslims as a whole as being this very kumbaya type of people. Like, we all get along all the time. There's no divisions because we all stand side by side and pray next to each other. But what happens once you say the salam? You know, there's a lot of bias, unfortunately, that exists within the Muslim community. There's a lot of behaviors that are not even recognized as racism because they're often labeled as, well, that's just my culture. And it's very important to be honest and have honest conversations within the Muslim community about that and say, hey, even though we might, as a whole, experience racism from the outside, especially here in the United States, there are absolutely behaviors that we have carried over. And when I say carried over, I mean, like, you know, from our parents' generations, they immigrated to this country, of course, facing a lot of prejudice, but also bringing a lot of prejudice with them. And we might, as the younger generation, have picked up on those as well.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Obviously, you know, we agree. I don't know if you've seen us like nodding our heads. But I think part of my experience, or, you know, my understanding as far as my experiences are concerned, is that we don't tend to really see how the Prophet ﷺ or how the Sahaba operationalized the framework that is Islam, right? And so, yeah, you know, we can toss out the concepts and the theories of, you know, justice and equality and, you know, everyone getting along. But one disconnect that I see is that we tend to, you know, operationalize it only in components of, you know, the religious ritualistic area. So making sure that, you know, Salah and that, you know, Ramadan is practiced and that you make Hajj or that you make Umrah. But when it comes to mu'amalat, you know, just the basic interpersonal relationships, that's one component that you see existed among the Sahaba that doesn't necessarily, or that approach doesn't necessarily exist on the same scale nowadays, as far as individuals extending themselves to build relationships with people that don't look like them, that don't speak, you know, the same language as them, that may not even practice the same quote unquote methodology of Islam as them. There are different, you know, layers of discrimination that exist, but I think most of it still operates under this hierarchy of, you know, racism and white supremacy.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point, and I, you know, I'd have to kind of piggyback on what the brother just said, because, you know, we don't tackle it partly because I think, kind of echoing what you just said, we don't see this kind of reaching across the aisle, destroying these issues as integral to Islam. Once you make ritual, you know, once you equate that with Islam and that is all Islam is, then you don't see this trying to heal these wounds as important. And also going back to what Safa said, because as I was thinking about this podcast, and I'm thinking about what do I want to say, what do I feel is appropriate to say, and sometimes you start getting worried about, you know, not making Muslims look bad, and that's unfortunate. And it's a real and true concern. Islamophobia is real, you know. But at the end of the day, also you can't kind of you know, defend Islam at the cost of your dignity as well. And other things too, you know. But it's like, okay, I don't want to expose us. Sometimes you feel like that, you know. So you want to say, oh, we Muslims, we all pray together, etc., etc., etc. Well, okay, that's all wonderful, but if there are serious issues that keep us from representing the Islam as we're meant to, then we need to have those conversations, even if it means admitting to our faults to one another, you know. And we know that this podcast, any white supremacist, Fox News, Sean Hannity person can get their hands on this podcast and, you know, oh, well, the Muslims are racist, or, you know, they're terrible, right? They can spin it. And you start thinking about, oh, snap. Well, I don't want that to happen. But in spite of that, we got to have these conversations, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's just important because I've heard you, Safa, say it, and then Relwan talk about, like, you know, how, like, outside of prayer, these are issues, but, like, I am thinking, like, even within prayer, like when people don't want to stand next to you because of the color of your skin or because of your like your ethnicity or your race, like those things are what I believe are like super important, right? Like these are the things that we really need to be discussing, because if it prohibits you from praying next to me, then like this is an issue, right? Like we need to talk about this. We can't save face, outwardly if inwardly people aren't even praying next to each other, or standing side by side as a matter of prejudice and race and just all of those types of things.
Or even returning the salams,
right?
Like that one. I myself have a myriad of experiences, but even friends where it's like you extend the salam to, and you don't get a salam return, despite it being your right, one of your rights as a Muslim. And so, but again, to her point, to everyone's point, there needs to be, a conversation around like what takes place outside of just the acts of worship.
And I think going back to Relwan's point, like definitely Fox News could get a hold of this podcast and it could look bad for us Muslims. But at the same time, I feel like this podcast, it's not really, so much for like the outside, but it's also for the inside as well. Like we're addressing the subject for the Muslims who are already Muslim, who are already having these issues, as opposed to trying to save face with the people who aren't even Muslim. So I feel like, it's important that we work on, kind of mending those wounds we have in the Muslim community before we focus on trying to save face. Because once we get this situation resolved, we build some community, as Muslims, then we can tackle the outside problems like no problem.
I love the optimism that we're going to be featured apparently on Sean Hannity's show. But with that being said, that's why we're having these discussions here. And I think this is a very good point to kind of delve deeper into the splits within the community. And we want to make sure that in this podcast, we target these issues appropriately. And that's why we don't want to, mask our words. We want to be wise with the way we want to talk. We want to use wisdom and hikmah, which is wisdom, in the way we approach this topic. But at the same time, we don't want to almost sugarcoat it either. And I appreciate you all for that. And Kassidy, I'm going to hand it over to you. I think this is a good point to delve into the deeper question.
Yeah, most definitely. And Ismaaeel, what you said really, really resonated with me because in tackling these outside issues, you have to come together as a united front, and this is to hopefully bring us to really get to be like one ummah. So with that, I want to talk specifically about the Triangle community. Do you all find racism both overt and subtle between Arabs, Desis, Africans, all races and ethnicities?
Yes. I used to assist in a youth mentoring group, right? And so the vast majority of these kids are what we would consider like first generation Americans. So maybe their parents came over, but they were born here. And so one of the topics of conversation was, just around relationships, like boyfriend, girlfriend, they're teenagers. And so everyone expressed their parents' disdain for marrying Black women, and how it would be unacceptable if they were to come home wishing to, marry a Black woman. And so, and again, this is, out of Desi, but even, some African American, right? So we have this internalized racism, right? We have the colorism that exists. But then also we have just around clear-cut religious texts that speak out against this particular practice, but the overwhelming presence of this very same practice within the RTP community. And that is one in which it is, disagreeing or denying, someone's hand in marriage solely off of the base of that person not coming from the same country or the same tribe or the same ethnicity as, your daughter, per se.
Yeah, and I think that's very sad because, to your point, it shows that even if the kids found genuine interest in somebody from an outside culture, that could be completely voided simply because their parents didn't like the color of their skin. Not because the kid didn't like it, but because the parents didn't. And so I think that creates an even bigger issue because the kids start to grow up with that mindset, like, okay, my parents must think that there's something wrong with her skin for a reason or their skin for a reason. And so now they start to pass it on to their kids, and that's when the cycle just continues and we can never break it. So I feel like that just creates an even bigger issue.
And Brother Arssante, you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, did I say your name correctly? Okay, awesome. I just wanted to follow up on one thing you mentioned, which you said that you've experienced personally that people don't return your salams. I think that's a huge, huge issue. I've heard it for secondhand from a lot of different people. There was this one brother who reverted to Islam like several years ago, and my parents have been active in the Dawah committee for several years at IR. But we happen to know about this one brother, Black Muslim. You know, usually when you convert, everyone is so happy to see you the first 5 minutes after your shahada. And then, you know, what usually happens is if you're white, you get adopted immediately by the community. Or maybe I shouldn't say immediately. I'm sure everyone, you know, they take time to integrate into the community. But it's a little bit easier if you're white, right? This brother, he told us that, you know, my mom just went up to him one day. She was like, "Assalamu alaikum, do you want to come over for dinner?" And he was like, "You are the first person in this community who has ever like come up to me and said salam first to me and then tried to welcome me into their home." And that was depressing to hear because he had been Muslim for several months at that point. I think that speaks to just how deeply rooted racism is in the Muslim community, that we can't even return each other's salams because you have to like profile the person first.
You know, so thank you for naming that. You know, I've seen Black non-Muslims be chased away from the masjid simply, you know, I mean, I've witnessed this, right? And so again, you know, back to the brother's point, Relwan, your point as far as us being plagued by the same societal diseases that impact everybody else, right? Unless we take the same level of intentionality to kind of like deconstruct and heal and address and name, right, these practices. But you were going to say something? I know, I'll put you in that.
Yeah, no. I was going to say something because I oftentimes think about this, like, because I think about the Islamic community in the Triangle areas, like in a bubble, right? Mm-hmm. And I think about it, how closely it mirrors like white supremacy. And so, like, if you are of like Arab descent or Desi descent, then you have like, this is your whiteness, right? Like, this is you are access. You know, like you have access to the religion, right? As if someone owns it, as if a group of people can own it, right? But that's how it kind of comes off. And so if you're not like that, or the closer you are to Blackness, in my experience, has been like othered. And so like you know, it's like, are you really Muslim? Like, where are you from? But like, where are your parents? Like, so all of these questions to legitimize the fact that you should be, you know, that legitimizes your Islam. And so those have been my experiences, particularly here in the Triangle, so much so that you see like pockets, you know, like either Black Muslims, and I think also when I say Black, I'm primarily talking about African American, because there's also kind of some divide with Africans, right? Mm-hmm. So like, and I've heard firsthand, like, you know, families that come here and like when they have children, right? So they are taught not to align themselves with African Americans, right? Like, you know, they're terrible, like, don't be a part of it. But I cannot understand it, right? Like, I cannot understand the logic behind it. And maybe we'll get to that conversation like later on, you know, during our time together, but just kind of the nuances of like who can be Muslim without question and who can't. And I think that's a really big thing in the Triangle community.
And to add to that, for someone else to pick up as well, because we've said enough, is the perceptions of knowledge, or perceptions of who is knowledgeable within the community. And so just, you know, personal experiences of who is selected to lead the Salah when all of these individuals are strangers. Now, I may know these individuals and I may know who has recited or memorized or learned more Quran than another, but someone coming in may pick someone that doesn't look like me simply because he is assumed to be more knowledgeable than us.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so pernicious that and Muslims don't want to be racist, and I don't want to talk too much, so just cut me off. But like everything y'all said, it's true. The whole marriage thing. So I've heard it time and again, and the parents doesn't want to be racist, and they don't believe they're racist, and they'll give all sorts of excuses, but you just feel that no, their hesitation is because of this person's race. And this is across the board from Arabs to Desis. And yes, I have to admit it as well. You get it in the African community or recent immigrant community, most certainly, right? And so in their person's self-understanding, they're religious. So they don't want to just flat out say that, oh, I don't want you to marry an African American. But really, you can just sense it. And growing up from that community, I know it. And I've heard it that, you're different somehow. And why is that? Because they have basically learned, they've accepted those negative characterizations of African Americans, right? And so that's why we say this white supremacy is so infectious, and it taints everybody, to the point that it can get Africans, which doesn't make any sense because white supremacists see you as black, but it can get Africans to look at African Americans in a certain way. And again, I don't want to talk too much because we have other questions, but I also want to echo what was said earlier about the knowledge thing too. Sometimes it can be so condescending because the person means well, but you recite well. Oh, mashallah, that's so wonderful, and it's like, okay, but I can tell that the reason why you're so you're speaking so positively because you're surprised that this African American or this African can recite well. And why are you surprised? And it's strange, so there's something going on there. The reason why you're surprised is because you feel like this thing is yours, you feel like this thing called Islam is yours, and you've kind of given it to the other people. And so you're so amazed that somebody else can recite or lead Salah, all these things, and part of it is like, we need to increase racial awareness. There needs to be at least an awareness that sounds bad. There needs to be an awareness that, oh, how am I presenting right now? Because maybe I sound like I don't think such a person could recite. That kind of introspection, we've got to really kind of call for that more, I think.
Absolutely.
But even that within itself is a conversation about Tawheed. You see what I'm saying? Because how can an individual be surprised at the recitation of another individual when we're talking about the Khalqullah and when we're talking about the power of Allah? Right? And so who can, who can even take a position to be amazed that Azza wa Jal, and even it's in the Quran, Allah puts his bounty and his pleasure and his grace where he wills. And so, again, this is, it's like we have this framework, but it's just a framework, right? And we only apply it to different parts of our lives that we, are comfortable with. But alhamdulillah, like Islam, back to even conversations among the Sahaba, is that every part of our lives Islam touches. And so, but again, like it takes us as Muslims to identify those different parts that there may be a disconnect and have conversations around how to establish that reconnection.
And I'll say this, and I know I promise we'll be quiet. I just wanted to say that fact that when you mentioned, something about the racial difference, it's like because we're so scared to talk about it, it allows this thing to go unchecked because everybody is so scared. It's like, like I feel like we oftentimes, like even when we hear like in the khutbah, it's kind of like this like kumbaya, everybody gets along. And I think Safa, you mentioned that, and it's just like that can't be, and we can't keep saying that because it allows these things to to continue to manifest, right? Like because nobody wants to admit that these things are happening in our community. So I want to applaud the podcast directors for even having this as a conversation.
Yeah. And to add on to what Sister Brittani said about the Muslim community mirroring the American community, so you know how certain groups, they have the privilege. Islam is expressed through them. We know Islam by looking at them. And the result of that is that now many people that are not that feel like they need to, in the American culture, you move up the ladder by adjacency to whiteness. For us, is adjacency to whiteness and also to Arabs and maybe Desis as well. So I got to start dressing with the thobe and I gotta start speaking Muslimese. Some people have heard me use this word before. In order to look like Muslim, I gotta start performing the Arab Islam, right? That's the problem, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think you guys all collectively mentioned a lot of topics that, you know, this big word of racism can be broken down into, and these different perspectives and these different aspects of racism that we really need to address. And I promise we're going to talk about, I know you guys mentioned colorism. We have a question about that. We're going to talk specifically about the white patriarchy or this white supremacy. We're going to touch on that as well. And then we are going to go back to, you know, Islam and, you know, how do we find solutions within Islam? And I'm glad you guys mentioned the marriage issue. You guys mentioned the knowledge issue. And I think we're going to come to that hopefully by the end of this podcast. But I do want to move this conversation to perhaps a unique point that at least personally I haven't heard discussed often, because whenever we talk about racism in general. But racism can also have a very personal, unique experience. And so I want to kind of nuance this term into maybe dividing it up into genders, in terms of, does the male gender face racism differently, or perhaps in another aspect or another perspective, versus how women perhaps face racism in the Muslim community. So does racism vary amongst the genders?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I can speak on it from the perspective of the African American community. I know my mother, she's an African American Muslim, and I know from her experience from other sisters in the community, they have a hard time getting married because a lot of Arab men or Desi men, they don't really want to marry them. And then even in the African American community, a lot of African American men, they actually don't, gravitate towards them either. They actually look to go get their prize from like the Arab or Desi community. And so I think that's like very strange amongst our community, because that makes it even harder for us to actually, solidify ourselves within the community when we don't even support each other. And so like, I love to see, Sister Brittani and Brother Arssante, a beautiful African-American couple, mashallah. I wish I could see more of that in the community. But I know I do see a lot of African-American brothers gravitate towards more Arab or Desi or other foreign sisters, which is interesting to me.
I think this is twofold, right? Because whatever circumstances are unique to one's gender within the society, I think you find similar experiences play out in subgroups, right? And so for me as a Black man, naturally, my position in society in general is one of, subservience, subservitude. There's many like negative connotations that are associated with the existence of a Black man, right? And so I found also there's a similar nuance to my experiences as a Black Muslim. And this is me, alhamdulillah, being a Black Muslim that has been a Black Muslim in several different countries where Islam is practiced. And so even with that, I find similar experiences is that I am looked at as having, less knowledge, less access, less power, less autonomy, right? Even in the ways in which I'm communicated with, alhamdulillah, I can manage, in Arabic, right? And so even in the conversations that exist among Arabs and the terminology that may be used when I'm being addressed or when I'm being, conversed with, those all are different indications of where the value is applied and seen, right? And so, and then even, in a very similar fashion, just seeing the experiences of sisters, right? The experiences of Black women and how they're, being told where to go and what to do and how to be, where that very same approach I haven't seen, in my community with Muslims of other races. And so again, like what our experiences are in a society in general, you see those same similar experiences played out in our community.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's a little bit more nuanced than simply, gender, because I think that there are some intersections at play. And so when I think about, being Black and Muslim, versus being like Desi and a female and Muslim. Like, I think there are some differences, right? And so I think that in my experience and the experiences of my friends, similar to your mom, Ismaaeel, is like unmarried Black Muslim women, it's very difficult. It's very difficult for them to get married and to be courted in a way that's, to be courted, number one, but even the value and the way in which they are courted when they are, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think there's some variances in the level of like effort. Like first, coming to a Black woman, a Black Muslim woman, and you have 3 wives, like 3 wives versus like you coming to someone of another race or ethnicity, as the first wife, and just like the value and the care that is given to them. So I think those things are important. And the question that's being asked is a little complex. And I think it really is coming from your the perspective, which I know you all said that this is from our personal experiences, but I think that and I think in what I've experienced, I'll leave it at that. I think that's it.
I have some experiences that my friends have shared with me. So probably Sister Brittani, if you've also witnessed these things, I'd more love to hear from you as well. But I have had friends tell me that the whole policing of Muslim women's modesty is double on Black Muslim women. And that is in part due to colorism. We're just, the community tends to be harder on Muslim women who are not as light-skinned. But I've also noticed the policing of hijab and the way, the turban-style hijabs will tend to get, very bashed very publicly in ways that, that's not how you correct people. And first of all, that's not how people will frame it as advice, I'm just trying to correct this person. I'm just trying to tell you how the Quran says it. And there's absolutely no cultural sensitivity. There's absolutely no care for the feelings of these women. And on top of that, there's this very specific standard that we hold Muslim women to. And I'd like to say the framework for the ideal Muslim woman is a petite Arab woman. And every woman who doesn't fall into that category is basically beat down on by the rest of society. And I'm keeping it vague purposefully because, that's not my experience and I don't want to comment too much about it. But I'd like to ask Sister Brittani if you would like to speak more on that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen and been on the receiving end of it, right? Like, so I've witnessed the harshness, especially to revert or convert Muslims, Black African-American Muslims, to the point where they left the masjid and never come back, right? Like, never come back. Because, and I also feel like saying that it is a cultural practice is a cop-out, because I've seen the same people reminds folks from their own cultural group in a way that is gentle. And so the harshness that Black Muslim women receive is, I don't know that I have the language to say how it makes me feel, but I think that it is absolutely, I think it's poor. I think it's ridiculous. I don't, I feel like I don't have a way to sugarcoat the actions as if the worth, not even of them being Muslim, but just them being human, right? Like, that you are able to communicate with someone and remind them in such a way that you believe that they'll take the reminder versus like admonishing them and in a way that is punitive and making them feel
less than,
regretful or less than, or, that they don't belong at all. And so those are things that I have been on the receiving end of and have witnessed, folks like coming and bringing them to the masjid and them, taking shahada and them coming back for Jumu'ah and like, people reprimanding them in such a way that it's almost like they run away. And so I think that this is something that is definitely a practice here in this area. And I think that wanting to stay true and not completely lose yourself by, I think Brother Relwan was talking about the performance, right? Like performing Islam by thinking you have to do it exactly like the Arabs do it. You have to wear all black. You have to wear niqab. You have to do all these things. And then you lose yourself. And then you also end up losing some of your religion, right? Because you're trying to recreate something without, having these foundational elements of what does it mean to be Muslim.
Yeah, exactly. Like what you just said, Brittany, reminded me of like I feel like trying to please other people, but at the end of the day, like we're only supposed to try to please Allah. Um, but Safa, you've touched on this briefly throughout our conversation so far about colorism. And I want to make this. I want to dive deeper into this. How does colorism factor into all of this? Um, yeah.
I think I have a lot to say about colorism from a Desi perspective because I think we have a myth in our community, especially among, I want to say the American-born generation, that colorism among Desis is a colonial construct, and that is so painfully untrue because South Asian societies is where we had the birthplace of the caste system. And casteism is very heavily rooted in colorism. That was around way, way before Europeans ever set foot in South Asia. So when we say, these are colonial mindsets of our parents, no, it's not. These are millennia of conditioning to see white skin as more beautiful and dark skin as ugly. And it's a little bit shocking because, like, within the Desi community, there is a lot of, colorism within biodatas and like the marriage conversations and stuff like that. So I just find it so interesting when our community, specifically like among Desis, we go so hard against racism, things like that, or Desis like to say we're not racist, et cetera, et cetera. But then in your biodata, you're saying, I want a light-skinned girl for my son. There's no way you can divorce the two from each other. Colorism and racism go hand in hand. And unfortunately, South Asian culture is very heavily rooted in colorism. And I think that's something we need to be very honest about.
Yeah, and this relates to the earlier question too. So the view in the popular culture that was taught was blackness is both malicious and ugly, and I think the way it affects us is some ways. I think that black men get the malicious angle a bit more, so they're somehow is a source of danger. And sometimes I do feel when I'm in a space that's primarily of one race, and I'm the only black man, I do wonder that I have the experience of they're afraid of my danger, right? I get that. That's what I'm feeling, right? But on the side of the woman, I do think that there's a notion of black women not being beautiful because again they've taken on beauty standards, and so there's a pecking order then. So the lighter you are, the more beautiful you are, most certainly. And so that's one way in which colorism has impacted us. Yeah.
But also there is back to that the colorism and how it parallels access, right? And so, for example, there have been many conversations among brothers where they want to marry an Arab or a sister from Mauritania or what. I want my children to get the language access, right? I want my children to get the language of the Quran. I want my children to grow up, speaking Arabic. And so there's also that coupled with, prioritizing different, shades and how that equates to, value, right? So there's certain women that are more valuable within the Islamic community than others. And those that are most valuable are those that provide you the closest access to the religion. And so you would have Arab women at the top, and then you would have, Arabic speaking women, right? Next. And then you would have extremely practicing, right? Other races of women that still can give you the same level of access, but aren't as, pure in that hierarchical sense as the others, right? And so, and then on the other end, you have that access to, our society where you have, brothers trying to, marry women from our community because of the type of access that it provides in a secular sense, right? So we see that the colorism, it works kind of both ways where white women provide access on a secular level, Arab women provide access on a religious level, and then, there's other nuances that exist in between that, I've seen play out firsthand in RTP.
And strangely enough, just want to add that, strangely enough, sometimes whiteness can top all of that. For some folks, in fact, their parents might be more might kind of have more concern that their child is marrying a white person because, you know, they want to keep it insular. They want their child to marry a Desi or Arab or African, right? But the child, because of what he or she has inherited, you know, is looking for that white bride, which comes, you know, that's like a different phenomenon as well, but it exists, you know.
And Brother Relwan, this is I think a good point, a transition point that you brought up about this whiteness, right? Because we touched upon this concept of the white patriarchy. So moving away a little bit from colorism, or maybe even associated with colorism, we talk about white patriarchy, but what are your thoughts about its impact in the Muslim community, and how does it connect with what we're talking about, in terms of racism? White patriarchy is a word or is a concept that's being discussed not just in the Muslim community, obviously, but just in the general community overall. And there's heated debates over this, and all that, but how does it boil down in the Muslim community? How does this impact our topic here today in our daily lives?
I do think that to an extent, when we're having this conversation about a white patriarchy, we do have to realize that most of the positions of power in the Muslim community are still held by Arabs and Desis, with Arabs a little bit more on top of Desis. So I know that's changing. There's a lot of people who are whites who are converting to Islam who do tend to move up quite easily through the rankings of power. But in terms of who controls the masjids, who creates the welcoming spaces, that's largely defined by the Arabs and Desis. And a second caveat to that, I think, is that Arabness, I think, Brother Relwan, you mentioned this a little bit, Arabness is kind of like the white of the Muslim community. Like, Arab is top tier. And that's why you also see a lot of Desi men not trying to marry Desi girls, but trying to marry Arab women as well. I think there's a lot to be said about how much power the Arab community has because Islam originated from the Arabian Peninsula. So simply by that association, it's seen to have some sort of superiority. And that's something that is sometimes purposefully spread among Muslims who are not Arab. So I'll stop talking there, and I'll let other people contribute more.
I haven't read enough about the concept of white patriarchy in terms of how it differs from other patriarchal systems. But I'm sure all of you noticed that this toxic patriarchal discourse is becoming more popular among our youth. The Muslim children, the Muslim boys are, there's something going on with them. And what I'm noticing as well is that we all know the different conversation. The wider you are, the more audience you're going to get. And so it's an interesting phenomenon that some of these voice boxes for Islamic patriarchy that are very popular are either white or white adjacent, and they're extremely popular. We have a lot of black toxic toxic masculinity folks too. We got a lot of Arab toxic masculinity folks. But the increasingly popular ones, y'all know them. I don't need to say their names. Are white or white adjacent. So it's almost a strange intersection that allows them to be popular. I've just noticed that because of this question, because I haven't really considered white patriarchy as opposed to others. Yeah.
No, I would say that I definitely agree with you, Brother Relwan, but also just kind of like within the Muslim community, Safa, what you mentioned about like how it is run and like how Masajid are run by Arabs and then Desis, like the way that top down, trickle down, like I liken it to the exclusivity of it all. Like if you are not part of these, then you are like pushed out of the masjid, right? Like you do not belong here. When you come in, you get funny looks. It's like, why are you here? There are like these private gatherings that happen. It really is all a little bit bizarre. And I really feel like I mentioned it already, but I really just feel like, especially in this triangle area, that our Islamic community really mirrors like our capitalistic colonial, I mean, yeah, our the whiteness and the privilege and power that comes along with being able to align yourselves with whiteness. Like, I think those two things, like, I see them kind of parallel to one another, right? Like what happens in our Islamic community here, and then kind of like all of these things that we have long been talking about, like in our society at large, those things are happening in our Islamic community. It's just that, like, instead of like a white patriarchy, it's like this Arab patriarchy that's happening in the Muslim community.
One moment. So I would also like to add, when we think about the history of patriarchy or white patriarchy, we can't understand it without contextualizing it around the Spanish Inquisition, right? And the need for dominance and the need for control and the need to define the values of other identities to substantiate the, oncoming slavery that would be used to kind of, build up these empires, right? And so in a very similar framing, we see the xenophobic approach to some of our dealings within the Islamic community, where, to Brittany's point, if you don't align with a particular ideology or identity, then you are othered, and in that othering, there is this process of dehumanizing that the individual goes through, and that is either through erasure. It is either through silencing of their voices and them not, having any space carved out for them to, grow and thrive within the environment. It could, simply just be, disregarded and dismissed. But all of these, elements is still under that process of dehumanizing that exists within white patriarchy. It's the same reason why the elderly are treated the way that they are, why children are treated the way that they are, why individuals that don't produce are treated the way that they are. And so, we've, again, back to Relwan, you hit the nail on the head. And even, subhanAllah, no, there's a hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he says what? That we'll follow, we'll mimic or imitate the Jews and the Christians until if one of them were to enter, a rabbit hole, we would, a lizard hole, we would follow. And so in a similar, framing, it's like all of these patterns and systems and ideologies that we see, non-Muslims kind of being inundated with, we begin to adapt and adjust and integrate in our own dealings.
Can you guys hear me? I think my mic. Absolutely. Thank you. So we've been talking about a lot of issues, and we've been talking about it from perhaps, different aspects of this big word, racism, right? And here's something that I think we should, I want to hear your thoughts on this, right? Do you think that racism is decreasing in the younger generation as opposed to perhaps the older generation? Because, do we have a hopeful future in the sense that, our youth is getting better at this, at countering this, or is the future still a little, doom and gloom? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think so. I think that we have these layers, right? Because not only now, are they getting, like, do they have this cultural background from their parents in the household, but now they are, integrated into this, like, our American society where there's this, like, it's like a coupling of it. So I think that in some ways, I know we're not. Are we more, they may be more aware and more vocal and kind of like naming the things. Do I think they are getting better with processing it or understanding the wronging, like how it's wrong? I do not think so. And I say this just based off of experience where, like, we can still go to the masjid. I'll walk past a group of youth and, like, the conversations that are being had are like, I'm like, it's mind blowing, honestly. It's like, wow, y'all are, like, really just so comfortable, like, saying these things and say, like, using euphemisms that they have no business, right? And so I won't repeat them here, but it's just like, you can't be that saying these words. Like, it's not okay. And then, having youth interacting with my own children and having my children called names, it makes me actually, fearful, and also it makes me remove my children from those environments. And so, like, as a mother of African American children, my children cannot be in Islamic schools because too many times the conversations and the way that they are ridiculed based on race, the way that they have terminology used against them based on their race, lets me know that, like, this is like a double whammy, right? So, like, you're dealing with, like, them coming, you know, what they're getting at home, what they may be hearing, like, from popular culture. And that's like that mix is like nothing. It does not make me hopeful for what is to come from our youth in terms of being able to recognize racism, the implications of it in the Muslim community, and working to dismantle and disrupt the ways that goes on. I have not seen that happening.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we still view, and by we I say some Muslims, we still view racism as a white-black problem, as that's their issue, their history. They need to sort that out, and in that. In our denial of identifying our role in it, like was stated earlier, we allow it to continue to exist, and we allow it to, be perpetuated even among our children, because conversations like this are the exception. They aren't the norm, and that's, again, like part of the issue.
And so for us, it's either remove and then find, kind of like find your Muslim community that's not necessarily like at this particular masjid or this particular masjid, or just have to, just kind of figuring out. And I think that's something that's important to talk about in this race conversation too. It's like, when you've experienced racism so much in your Islamic community that you now feel like you have to remove yourself from your community, how are you gathering and being in community with other Muslims if that's where you were getting it from, and now you don't have that access anymore, right? Because you've had to make a decision for your own self, for your Islam, and then for your children and their Islam, to protect that, so they won't grow up, they won't grow up aligning these behaviors from other Muslims with Islam, so that they now do not want to be a part of Islam. You know what I'm saying? They don't want to be Muslim. They don't want to associate themselves with it because all they've had are these negative interactions.
Yep. I mean, absolutely. I have to second all of that, because one way it's getting better, to give some hope, is that I think young Muslims don't want to be racist. And that's such a terrible litmus test. That's pretty bad. But, for like to be able to say, oh, yeah, you don't want to be racist. But the fact of the matter is that has not always been the case. People in the past generations didn't mind that they felt they were better by virtue of being a different race, and that other races were worse by virtue of being another race. People before us didn't have a problem thinking that X race, that race is not good. They didn't have a problem with that. I think the younger generation, they would theoretically think that's a problem, right? But in actuality, they still have condescending attitudes, and they still speak out of turn. I mean, it's a problem that, I'm way past college now, so, 10 years out of college or so, but in college, you've got college-age students that are friends, that are well-meaning, saying the silliest things, dumb things like assuming you can play basketball, or, just the dumbest things, like, because you're black, so they've made certain associations with black people, right? And they just say it. I'm like, what? You don't have the kind of awareness to just know, oh, shoot, I think that, but let me not say it. The fact that you lack that awareness is a serious problem. The fact that they don't recognize how ridiculous this sounds, that they might be rapping certain lyrics, and I'm right here. It's a problem that you don't, it's already a problem if you do it in private, but you're so unaware that you can do it around me. That's a problem, so yeah. But I think they don't want to be racist. That's why I'm glad we can have these conversations,
I think I'd agree with you, Relwan, that, the younger generations, like just thinking of like my own friends and whatnot, they don't want to be racist. But Brittani, what you were saying of, like, I feel like the essence of like kind of what I'm getting is, sorry, lost my words for a second. that essentially people are all talk. They're like, oh, like, no, I'm not racist, but yet they're still perpetuating these microaggressions by not saying salam. The way that they speak with their friends when they think no one's listening, but of course everyone's listening. But they'll be quick to say like, oh, no, I'm not racist, but yet still perpetuating that. So I think that us, like youth, we have to look within ourselves, and we have to check ourselves, we have to check our friends, and we just people around us to keep them in line. But I want to shift the focus a little bit more. So I'm curious to know, like, how does Islam tackle racism? What does it say in the Quran, in the Hadith, in the Sunnah, and like, what are some solutions that we can take from Islam and what we've learned as Muslims? Talk about marriage, having kids, even down to friend groups. Yeah, what do y'all think?
I've heard people say that the story of the first racist is told in the Quran, and that is Shaitan himself, who looked at Adam alayhi salam and he said, oh, خَلَقَتَنِي مِن نَارٍ وَخَلَقَتَهُ مِن طِينٍ. You made me from fire and he's made of clay. You expect me to show any kind of difference for him? And people don't want to be like Shaitan, of course. We hear this quoted all the time in the khutbahs and stuff like that, saying, look how arrogant Shaitan is. But we fail to see that arrogance in our own selves. So I think that the fact that Shaitan discriminated against Adam alayhi salam because of what he was made of. Adam alayhi salam he didn't even have the soul blown into him yet. He was just based on image alone, Shaitan thought he could make that distinction and say, I'm inherently better just based on how he looks. And I think that's an extremely powerful lesson that I don't think enough Muslims reflect on. The fact that arrogance is at the root of racism. The fact that the most arrogant the most arrogant being to ever exist is Shaitan, and we're mirroring his behaviors in the Muslim community every single day. I think that's a big point that more Muslims should reflect on.
Yeah, and not only Shaitan, the second most arrogant person, arguably, in the Quran was Pharaoh. We saw how he treated the children of Israel. He discriminated against them. He did not want anything to do with them. He killed their children, this and that. And you see how Allah dealt with him in the Quran. It was a very painful punishment, and we know where he's going in the afterlife, and it's all because of his arrogance. And so I know we're not on the same level as Pharaoh. I would not claim that, but at the same time, we are taking those little baby steps in that direction. That arrogance, it starts small, but then it grows and becomes more and more, dangerous. And I feel like we have to kind of snub that out before it becomes, to that danger level.
Yeah, and I'll add just recognizing that all of us are Bani Adam. We are all children of Adam, and to actually believe in that I'm no more human than you are. All of these things are superficial to an extent. They have a reality because they're social realities, so they're real. But at the end of the day, I'm not more human than you or used more than I am. And if we truly believe that, then it's harder to see somebody as less than by virtue of race. And also, I think Islam encourages us to do muraqabah, right? So reflect, always looking inward, so that way it will really, I think, call you to interrogate your biases. Don't just move on autopilot, So that if you come across somebody, because I'm a human being too, I might be susceptible to, thinking stereotypically about others. So I need to think, why did I think that about this person? Could it be because I've somehow learned, I've somehow accepted views that have no basis about X people? I need to check that, Yeah. So just assuming that I could fall prey to those kinds of things.
In addition to that muraqabah, that reflection that you mentioned, really actually, researching and trying to apply the numerous of ayat that actually speak to this topic, right? In the very same surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ Verily, we made you into tribes and nations, لِتَعَارَفُوا so that you know one another. But you can't know one another without being vulnerable and having a relationship and valuing the other thing that you see, right? So even in that ta'aruf, there's a level of respect and dignity that exists between those two people, right? And so, again, taking that framework but then actually implementing it into your daily affairs. Allah says in, I think it's sort of, no, I can't remember the surah, but Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu la yaskhur qawmin min qawm. Don't have a group of you discriminate and look down upon and scoff another group of you. Asa an yakuna khayrun minkum. It could very well be that they're better than you. So, I mean, again, it's like we have the framework, we have the tools, but we only take them out when it's, time to give a khutbah. We only take them out when it's time to have a Quran competition. We only, so it's like we have the frameworks, but we're not comfortable with these. It requires us to also relinquish power in the process. And I think that's part of the discomfort, right? But if you look at how the Prophet ﷺ had the society set up, visitors coming in couldn't see where the power existed in the community. They couldn't tell that he was Amir al-Mu'mineen. They couldn't tell that the individual sitting in front of him was the most powerful, had the most authority in the Islamic community in the region. And so, but we don't mirror that approach, because when you come into the masjid, it's like, yeah, this is the, the council, and this is, it's like you have to highlight all of the positions of power, and you have to gravitate towards all of the positions of power. And we see that particular approach isn't even from the Sunnah. When it comes to leadership, even it was a methodology of the Sahaba that those who vie for leadership should be denied it. And so again, it's like there's this disconnect in how we actually implement Islam. We're comfortable with our cultural norms, and we're comfortable with, the ritualistic performance, the performative component, but there are other nuances, our character, right? There are other, how we get along with one another, all of which are actually acts of worship. And so again, like when I say, like, it goes back to Tawheed, like, how are we really understanding Islam, and how are we understanding our relationship with one another, right? Because our relationship with one another is an extension of our relationship with Allah. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, like, whoever rectifies what is between him and Allah, Allah rectifies what is between him and the people. And so we see that there's a connection between our relationship with one another and our relationship with Allah. All of our deeds go up every single week, except for those of Muslims who are beefing with each other. Allah doesn't even look at the deeds of Muslims who are in disagreement with one another. And so we see, like, there's this emphasis on being able to be in community, but like, it stays on the shelf.
That was beautiful. I think, no, and I feel like I got a little mini khutbah right there.
That's what I just said.
No,
What's the thing that I just said? I was like, okay, mini khutbah.
No, I loved it. And a lot of these, if we were to kind of summarize everyone's point, the answers are locked within, or not even locked, they're accessible. Locked makes it sound like they're not accessible. They're freely accessible in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in the tradition. But I guess it goes back, it made me kind of think of how it goes back to character. And, the Prophet ﷺ, he told us that, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ حُسْنَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, I have been sent to perfect character. And when you think about that, it's like, okay, there's so many aspects of character, but this is part of that, right? To deal with those things. And then I thought about another thing in terms of, racism is inherent in humanity. Like we all have that little bit of racism, some more than others. We have that little arrogance within us, because it really stems from arrogance. And how, just like it takes, your entire life to improve your character, to really perfect your character, it takes kind of your entire life to slowly kind of let go of these cultural elements. But there's things that you can start with, and there's things that you can apply today to make sure that you can start on that journey so that at least, maybe beginning or starting off, you can get rid of those elements of racism, which are extremely harmful to those people you talk to on a daily basis, or those masjid goers and everyone you interact with around you. And then, there are elements that are more hidden within the heart, which can be slowly overcome over time. But it's taking those solutions and from the Quran and Sunnah and applying them to our character, applying them using our iman. And that, that's a whole nother topic about iman, like the Muslim community's iman. How do we improve that? Because, we talk about racism, we talk about a lot of issues in the Muslim community, and this is just my opinion, but I do believe these are all symptoms, and the cause is the weakness of our collective iman. And with that, we want to, inshallah, conclude with this final question, because again, we're Muslims, we want ihsan. I think whenever we bring up a problem, as Muslims, we should attempt to offer solutions. And I know you guys offered a lot of brilliant solutions. Let's say you were talking right now to community leaders. I mean, I know you guys are all community leaders as well, but let's say you were talking to other community leaders, whether these are imams, shuras, boards, but also to community members. What would you urge them to do today to at least start to solve this big problem that we have in our community?
Okay. So one solution, and of course there are many, is people need to hear Black Muslim speakers. So I think masjids needs to bring Black Muslim speakers, and more importantly, Black women scholars. You hardly see them, you hardly hear them, and by I mean speakers, not just scholars of Islamic knowledge. We need that most definitely, male and women, Black scholars of Islam, but also just of other expertise, other areas of expertise as well. They need to be seen so that the audience can recognize that there's excellence there too. Because unfortunately, it needs to go beyond teaching. It needs to go beyond theoretical knowledge. They need to actually see it. So I think Muslim leaders need to call on Black Muslim speakers and place them at the table, like let them lead, or at least be among the leaders. And if you're going to hire the Black Muslim speakers, you need to encourage your people to come, encourage your students or whoever comes to your halakas, tell them to come. And this one is a harder ask. Pay them a good stipend. It's a harder ask, but pay them to come. So that if nobody comes, because let's be honest, nobody might come, but it might be worth their time. And eventually we'll get there, inshallah.
Yeah, to build on that point you just made, Relwan, a personal example I have of that, I rarely ever see like African American speakers like in the masjid, but I know IAR had a fundraiser very recently, and they actually brought Sheikh Ubaidullah Evans to speak, at the fundraiser, and to me that was very touching. It almost made me kind of emotional because I've never seen like an African American capture the attention of so many Arabs and Desis. Like their eyes were fixated on him, on every word he said. And to me, that was like very motivational. It showed like that I could maybe even one day achieve the level of, the respect that he had at that moment. And so I feel like, definitely what Relwan said, you have to bring more African American speakers, because that's inspiration not only to other African Americans, but to also, the rest of the Muslim youth community, to show that, African Americans, they, are just as a part of the Muslim community as anybody else, and that we have the same amount of potential as anybody else as well.
Go ahead.
Just add just one thing, just that let's be okay that Islam presents in different ways, because we've got to have Black Muslim speakers and Black women speakers, and frankly, many Black people don't dress or speak or present in the same way as others. And I've been asked before, oh, that sister's earrings are out or her turban is out. And it was the strangest question to me, and I was like, wait, why is that even a thing? But people have these sorts of questions and they're like, oh, let's not, maybe we shouldn't bring her or him. And it's a ridiculous thing, right? But, I want to give grace. Oh, this person, they've learned a certain Islam that says that these people aren't worthy of hearing unless they present a certain way. That's wrong, and so when we say invite these different speakers, we really need to expand what a good speaker looks like, so that we can create this space, so just want to add that as well.
Yeah, I want to just echo both of what you all said, especially, Black Muslim women, and then also the importance of representation, right? Because what you said, Ismaaeel, my background is in education, right? So I'm just thinking about like we have some of these same issues in the field of education with teachers, right? Like we have a predominantly white teaching force. So the fact that you have named, like seeing someone who looks like you not only motivates and makes you dream of like what you one day could become, but also the captivation of the audience members that did not look like him. It's important for non-Black Muslims to see Black Muslims. Like, it is important for everybody. Everybody benefits from their presence, from our presence, right? So I just wanted to like second the things that you both have mentioned, but I also feel like it is upon those who are already in positions of power to talk about it. They have to talk about it. They cannot continue to sugarcoat it. They have to be explicit. And if they do not have the words, the language to talk about, they have to go learn and then be able to communicate. They need to, maybe it's a matter of having a co-cookbook where you have someone, you know, a black Muslim, like presenting with you, right? Like, I think that helps like get at all, like the audience at large. But then I always tell folks, like in the anti-racist work that I do, is like, you have to do self-reflection. You have to be self-reflective, because if you haven't taken the time to sit with yourself and be able to identify where you may be falling short, where you may be perpetuating racism yourself, you have to do that work. And then after you've done that work, you need to start doing the work with those closest to you, right? Like your aunties, your uncles, like those of you, those folks who this is kind of like this long thing, like this is all they've known. This is a practice that they think is cultural, but it really is a racist practice. You have to start naming those things and calling that stuff out so that they start to identify and be able to understand. And those conversations will be hard. They may be multiple conversations, but you have to do that if you are really committed to this anti-racist practice within our Muslim community.
I would add, I'm simple. I mean, really take a couple of steps back and think about our practice. Right, the brother Relwan mentioned, you know, bringing African Americans to the table. The Prophet ﷺ made Bilal the muaddin. One of the, if not the most important, you know, position outside of the imam. The entire community's salah, waking up in the, you know what I'm saying, is based upon this individual getting up and announcing the call to prayer. Right, and so we have examples. It's just actually taking these and implementing them. You mentioned da'wah. What I, you know, as I'm listening to you all, is da'wah. Allah says in the Quran, ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah. Right? And so part of calling to the path of Allah with hikmah is putting the proper people in place that will resonate with the audience. I mean, this was one of the things that made the da'wah of Abdul Wahhab so effective, was that he spoke in a colloquial manner with certain Arabs and certain tribes, and he spoke Fusha with other tribes. He changed the ways in which he communicated to impact the larger audience. And so it's like, again, like we have within our history as Muslims, within our text, within the, you know, the ahadith and the Quran and Sunnah, like we have a myriad of examples of ways to practically solve the problem. It's just that we actually have to look outside of just salah and fasting and those more, you know, overtly facing acts of worship.
And I just want to add that for those of you who may be listening, we know that Bilal is like a gem, but you got to go beyond that. We have heard so many, and that is literally probably the only name of a Black person that we've had, but there are so many more. So I challenge you to go further. Go further than that, because there's more excellence to be said, to be had, to be unfounded. I mean, to be found and to be shared with the Muslim community at large.
That are from the ulama as well. So not just
Amen.
Yeah, that are from the ulama.
If I could add something really briefly, this is one of my reflections from, you know, just trying to do some of the work of allyship with among, you know, Arabs and Desis. I would ask like our leadership and just people in general to just understand that simply because you can quote the hadith and recite the ayat does not make you immune to racism. And I've seen that happen quite a few times. Shortly after George Floyd was murdered, there was a group of people at one of the masajid, and I will not name which one, but we really wanted the masjid to put out a statement, you know, because it was a very difficult time for a lot of our friends. And there was this stubborn refusal saying, no, we don't need that because, you know, Islam has all the answers. And it's like, obviously, Islam has all the answers. That's why we're Muslim. But you can't just sit there and be like, yeah, Islam has all the answers. That in itself is you deflecting. You don't want to do the, like you all said, you don't want to look internally and see, like, how am I contributing to this? So you can't refuse to acknowledge that it's a reality. And on top of that, you can't refuse to acknowledge that there is so much depth in the scholarship. Like, it's not just about, bringing the scholars to the table, like, which is obviously, extremely important, but it's also about understanding that Arabs and Desis are not the only ones with, like, rich lineages of knowledge. Like, Africa as a whole. I know, what's his name? Mustafa? There's a lecture series Beyond Bilal. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the instructor. But he does yes, him. So he does an incredible job just breaking down the extensive history of scholarship in Africa. And it's so important. Like, when you don't know your own history, you can't, address the problems that you're facing right now. And there is this assumption among Arabs and Desis that, the scholarship is concentrated in those regions, which couldn't be farther from the truth. So we need to do some digging into the history of the Ummah as a whole, and then do a lot of introspection and understand that, it may be that you feel comfortable as an immigrant talking to people who look like you. That is fine if you are an immigrant and you want to speak to people who speak your own language. That is perfectly understandable. What is not okay is for you to sit in your own circles and not return someone else's salam, because we know full well you understand what that salam meant. And we also know full well that backbiting is haram, no matter who it's about. And yet, like, you're sitting there using derogatory words to describe people who share your faith. And so those things I think we need to address as well, because people will say, it's an issue of comfort for me. I want to be with people who are like me. And that's not an excuse.
Well,
can I just or add that I just think about the way that African Americans has sustained Islam in this country, being brought over as enslaved as enslaved Africans, and the fact that many of them came over as Muslim, and then all of the trauma that they face, and the violence, and the way that Black Americans have been able to sustain their Islam in spite of all of the things that they face. And I offer, I reverted to Islam, but just even the miracle or the mercy of Allah to return to Islam, right? Having been removed for a number of generations and then being guided back to it. And I just think that is a level of acknowledgement that is necessary when we think about the struggles. And I often think about the fact that, is it the case that in some way African American Muslims have made it easier for other non immigrants to come over and practice Islam in a way where they are not facing some of the extensiveness of things that could have been faced, because there's been groundwork that's been laid here already. And so when I think about some of the behaviors and are you Muslim that Black Americans face, it's just are you serious? It's just what? So I just wanted to offer that up.
So 100%. For Arabs and Desis, we would not even have been able to come to this country if it weren't. Sorry, what?
Oh, I thought you were.
Can you hear me? Oh yeah, I was saying for me, my parents could not have come to this country without the work of people like Brother Malcolm X. Because it was the civil rights movement that broke down the barriers that allowed Muslims from India, South, Pakistan, the Arabian Peninsula, to come over to the United States in the first place. This country was founded by Black Muslims. It was built by the hands of Black Muslims. And so that is something that the Muslim community, we can't say that, we're building the first masajid, because we're really not. The first masajid were in, these cellars, underground, in plantations. And that's the part of history that we're completely trying to wipe out by failing to have this conversation.
But again, back to how our community parallels and mirrors that of white supremacy and the approach to erasing the contributions of indigenous groups across the planet, right? We see a very similar, situation where, again, a lot of the progress that has been done, we don't have this collaborative approach to progressing forward. It's almost okay, you all have done, X amount of work to get to this point. We got it from here because your Islam or how you approach it or how you practice it or your history or your lineage or your lugha, right, isn't where we need it to be. So we got it from here.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you guys brought up these points. I do hope, community leaders and community members are actually, inshallah, will watch this and implement, if not all, at least some of these points, right? It's always better to start with something than to completely, look at the big mountain of that we have to climb. It's better to just take that first step and just keep going from there. I am happy to say, I have, at least from my field of view and knowledge, I've started to see some organizations coming out, so there's one of the incubator projects here at the Lighthouse Project called Muslim American History Project. It's by a brother Alec Ryder, who actually talks about history in general and specifically Muslim history in America. And he was doing a series, and one of the two or three of, almost all of the his episodes contain African American history, Muslim history in this, but he focused on specifically, during slavery, how many of the slaves that were brought over, they were Muslim or they had some Islamic heritage, and how many of those people preserve that religion, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. And that's why we can confidently say Islam has been in the Americas since the 1500s. And, if you want to believe certain people even before that, I'm not trying to spread any conspiracies, but, the point is, we have a rich African-American tradition. We have a rich African tradition. I love the point, Sister Brittany, that you brought up about, let's look beyond Bilal, right? I think that's what Sheikh Mustafa Briggs, his series is called, right? Beyond Bilal, because we always, that's our scapegoat almost, right? Like, Islam is not racist. We have Bilal radiallahu anhu, and Bilal radiallahu anhu is a gem for sure, no doubt. But there's more, right? And if you guys don't know, here's just 3 names. Just go and look them up, right? You got Ayman, right? You got Julaybib. You got Sa'ad al-Aswad. You got Ayman's son, right? Who was I'm forgetting the name. I believe it was Zayd Ibn al-Harith, if I'm not mistaken, or Osama. Sorry, Osama.
That's Al-A'mash.
Yes, sorry, it's Osama, right? You go look.
Yes.
These names. Yes, Osama, perfect. So look these names up, right? There's so much history beyond that we need to understand as Muslims, and hopefully we can start inviting, more African American speakers, even more African speakers, more diverse speakers in general. And alhamdulillah, it seems like we have a couple of speakers right here in this chat room, right? So if you're looking for speakers out there and you're listening to this podcast, just shoot me a text. I got a whole list for you now. Alhamdulillah. All right, inshallah, we're going to wrap up. It's, time flies when you talk about interesting stuff, and we've been here for about an hour and 22 minutes. So, inshallah, we're going to wrap up. I want to extend the most humblest and the most profound thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of our speakers here today. You guys really breathed life into this discussion. You almost realized this discussion in verbal form, and I think it was a very intriguing discussion personally, and I hope everyone finds it as such. But more importantly, I think it's a important discussion to understand. But I also admit that this discussion is not a wrap it all, right? This is just one piece, and we need millions of other pieces. But as I said, one step at a time, right? And so inshallah, I hope these kind of events or these kind of talks or these kind of initiatives continue so that we can, one step at a time, remove those toxic elements of racism from our Muslim community. I'll hand it over to Kassidy for final words, inshallah.
Mohsen, you just wrapped that up so nicely. I want to extend my deepest thank yous and gratitude. This conversation has been a long time coming. It is most definitely needed. I know that I've learned so much, and I hope that anyone who listens to this podcast also learns. We just have to encourage each other to educate ourselves and to look this ugly demon of racism in the face and deconstruct it, walk it back, so that we can have a more equitable society and Muslim community for today and tomorrow and generations to come. Again, thank you all so much. this is just the tip of the iceberg. I look forward to having more conversations with you all and other community members and leaders. And I look forward to making a change. So yes, thank you guys again.
Ameen to that. Jazakallah khair, guys. Assalamu alaikum.
You're welcome.
Alaikum salam.